Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe, I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, in full disclosure to you and our mansplaining audience, I had a colonoscopy yesterday.
Sounds like a great day. A great day.
Yes. And it probably also sounds like TMI, but hear me out. I bring this up not to elicit your sympathy, but because I think it actually dovetails nicely with today's topic about what makes a hero. So for much of this week, I showed great self-sacrifice by giving up my usual high-fiber diet to prep my bowel for the procedure. I was living on a prisoner's ration of white bread and saltine crackers for a few days. And in the 36 hours immediately before the procedure, I abstained entirely from solid food. I exhibited bravery in submitting myself to general anesthesia, knowing full well they'd be using propofol, which is the drug that killed Michael Jackson.
Yeah.
And then I had the strength of purpose to endure that surgery and come back barely 24 hours later to tape this episode with you now. So I think this definitely puts me in hero territory, but I'm anxious to hear whether you agree.
Well, I have to say, I feel like I can hear the Rocky theme playing right now. You're flying high now. A real American hero, Joe. So, yeah, I think you should be up there on Mount Rushmore right next to Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes. And it also, of course, betrays a little bit of my disdain for what I think is the misuse of hero, which is why I asked you to look into this in the first place. So what did you come up with for this one?
Well, thank you as always for the question. As we mentioned on the last episode, I have a deep personal investment in this topic because I got a PhD in mythology.
Yes.
So this is something I've been thinking about since I was about 10 years old. And just as a call out for our listeners, for every episode on our Facebook page, we publish the sources that we consulted for this episode. For this particular episode, I was basically just going off of memory. I will post sources, but they will be more in the area of recommended reading rather than the material I use to build out my report.
Fair enough.
But anyway, let's get started. The idea of the hero has a long, long history. The first literary hero that we know of was called Gilgamesh, a character who appears in a Babylonian text that has him fighting monsters and quarreling with the gods, and that dates back to 1500 BC. The first heroes that most people today would have heard of date a little bit later. The Iliad and the Odyssey survived to this day as written texts originally recorded in the late 8th or early 7th century BC, but they are probably based on oral traditions that go back centuries earlier. And these Greek heroes were very different from the heroes we hear about today. Let's start with Achilles, the greatest hero of the Iliad. Our listeners might have seen the movie Troy, which was allegedly based on the Iliad, but I'd like them to purge all memories of that movie permanently because it took a lot of liberties with the source material and is definitely on my shit list. The Iliad, if you don't know, tells the story of a group of Greek warriors, a series of tribes that traveled to Troy in Asia Minor because the son of the Trojan king had stolen the wife of one of the Greek kings. That's famously Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships. Those 1,000 ships were the ships of the Greeks sailing to Troy. And the Iliad talks about this time period when Achilles and Agamemnon, two of the greatest warriors among the Greeks, were having a vicious fight. And Achilles refused to fight, which was a calamity for the Greeks because Achilles was their greatest warrior. And so a lot of them were suffering because Achilles wasn't fighting at their side. In the Iliad, Homer describes a hero who is motivated by a single thing, kleos, which is translated to the English word fame, but has a slightly different meaning. Kleos for the Greek heroes was your reputation, the stories that people would tell about you when you weren't around anymore. And for a culture with an oral tradition, of which the Iliad and the Odyssey were a part, the stories, the songs that people would sing about heroes were a major part of their culture. So Achilles, as a Greek hero, was focused on one single thing, getting famous. He wanted to be remembered as the world's greatest warrior, and that's pretty much all that he cared about. And the contemporary Greeks didn't judge him for that because that's all they cared about too. The Iliad is a complex work with a lot of themes winding in and out of it, but one of the central ideas is the problem of mortality. Achilles was the son of a goddess, but his father was mortal, and that meant that he would eventually die as well. The question for all the heroes at Troy then was how they should live their lives, given that those lives might be very short. The answer that the Greek heroic tradition arrived at was that there are two forms of immortality. There's the immortality that the gods enjoyed, they would live forever, and then there's the immortality that belongs to a truly famous person, someone who is so great that he will never be forgotten. If your name lives on forever, then in a way you never die. The Greek heroes all hoped that once they were dead, people would still remember them and tell stories about them, stories like the Iliad. This was Achilles' goal in fighting at Troy, not to win the war or to get some other guy's wife back, but to do deeds of such glory and valor that his name would live forever. And that's pretty much it. Odysseus, the main hero of the Odyssey, was very different from Achilles in very many ways, but he also was an excellent warrior, and he also hoped that his name would live on after he was gone. Missing from any of the stories of Greek heroes are a single notion of good or evil. They didn't fight at Troy because the Trojans were bad people or because they worshipped other gods. The Greeks, like the Romans after them, pretty much assumed that all gods were the same. They just went by different names in different countries. The heroes fought at Troy because that's what heroes do. Achilles was the greatest of the heroes not because he was a better person, but because he was absolutely unstoppable in battle. A hero was someone who did great things, by definition. If you look at the etymology of the Greek word for hero, it goes back to an Indo-European root that means simply to do. If you're looking for a modern parallel to Achilles and Odysseus, probably the closest example is professional athletes. Michael Jordan would have felt right at home in ancient Greece. No one would have expected him to be a kind and decent person. They would simply have celebrated his excellence on the basketball court, and he probably would have loved it.
The man of action.
Yes, a man of excellent action.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is among these heroes of antiquity, it's about bravery and strength and fame, as you defined it, and kind of celebrity for their bravery and strength, right? But it's not about things like having a strong moral compass or having empathy or compassion. Is that correct?
That is correct. Those things will show up later in our story, but they are not yet part of it.
Okay.
And there was a second characteristic of ancient heroes that we need to point out, which is that they were all of royal blood. There were no commoner heroes in the ancient world. Many of them, like Achilles, were literally a breed apart in that they were children of gods. And there are inscriptions from the period suggesting that this was relatively common. Kings and warlords would claim that their lineage went back to the gods themselves, no doubt to justify their position on the throne. Heroes, in other words, didn't become great. They were born to greatness. So with that as backdrop, let's now jump forward about 1,500 years. Now we're in Europe during the medieval period, and there's a new breed of hero. He still carries a sword, but this time there's a cross emblazoned on his shield. The Song of Roland is a good example. Like Achilles, Roland is a fearsome warrior, but he's not fighting for himself. He's a soldier of God against an army of infidels. Roland was, in his time, a perfect human being, but he wasn't half God like Achilles was. By Roland's time, the divine had become entirely severed from this mortal plane that you and I live on. And Christian heroes like Roland and the saints had another quality that Achilles would have found completely bizarre: humility. There was not a single humble cell in Achilles' body. Pride was not a sin in the ancient Greek world. That is worth emphasizing because a lot of people get this wrong. Pride was not a sin until the Christians came along and said it was a sin. If you did great things, not only did you brag about it, you insisted that everyone else give you your due, much like Michael Jordan. The plot of the Iliad circled around a squabble between Achilles and Agamemnon over who should be recognized as, quote, the best of the Achaeans. And Achaean is a term that Homer used to refer to the various Greek tribes. Agamemnon had the most money and was the ruler of the biggest city, and he thought that should give him the title of best of the Achaeans. Achilles was a challenge to him, though, because everyone else knew that Achilles was a much better fighter. And so Agamemnon insulted Achilles as a way of putting him in his place, and Achilles' pride would not allow him to accept such a thing. He quit the fighting, which set the plot of the Iliad in motion. Modern readers tend to look at the Iliad and come away thinking that Achilles' pride was his downfall. This is something you'll find quite often when you look for definitions of classical heroes, that they had, quote, overweening pride. But again, pride was not a negative trait at the time. That's a modern reading, but it was not the original moral of the story. When it was composed, everyone in the audience would have agreed that insulting a man's pride like that was unacceptable, because of course a hero should be proud. His pride is simply a measure of his greatness. That's a theme I'm going to keep coming back to. A hero is a product and reflection of the culture and time period in which he or she was conceived.
Right, yeah.
I'll be talking here about the idea of the hero in Western cultures, but this would be a very different story if I was tracing the same idea in India, China, or Africa. There are authors out there like Joseph Campbell who will tell you that heroes mean the same thing at all times and to all peoples, but I confess I've never been much a fan of Campbell's work. I'm a much bigger fan of specificity and historical context. And expanding this podcast to include all the world's cultures while allowing time to all that cultural context would make for a several-hour episode, which would exhaust poor Joe, so I'm going to stick to a single cultural thread and leave the rest as an exercise for our listeners. Anyway, back to Roland and the theme of heroic humility. Unlike Homeric heroes, Christians are supposed to be humble. Christian theology holds that we're fallen creatures full of sin, and only God is great. That worldview forced a major change on the idea of the hero. Instead of a hero who is unstoppable in battle, often we see Christian heroes fight against impossible odds and die heroically. But don't worry, because they'll get an eternal reward in heaven. Instead of a man who fights for himself, now the hero is a man who fights for a cause. For Roland, that cause was honor, which required him to be perfectly loyal to God and to his feudal lord. Medieval heroes still famous today, like King Arthur and Sir Lancelot, also lived by a code such as chivalry, in which the hero is expected to dedicate his life to the values of courage, honor, justice, courtesy, and protection of the weak. And where, in the Iliad, there's hardly any difference between Greeks and Trojans, they worship the same gods and hold the same values, the Christian hero fits snugly into an us versus them way of looking at the world. The King Arthur legends arose in a time period after the Romans withdrew their legions from England, and the people left behind were trying to hold off waves of the barbarian raiders and invasions. As for Roland, he was imagined as a warrior fighting Muslims in Spain. The Song of Roland dates to between 1040 and 1115 AD, which was right around the time of the First and Second Crusade, which were attempts to wage a holy war that would stop Muslim expansion, reclaim for Christianity the Holy Land in the Middle East, and recapture territories that had formerly been Christian. The Song of Roland was a work of art, but it also functioned as an advertisement in support of this military campaign, and the hero of that epic was in effect drafted into the war.
Mark, it sounds like despite the differences you mentioned between the Greek idea of the hero, the earlier ideas, and the Christian idea, the through line, like the common denominator, is that whether you're fighting for yourself or fighting for your Lord or fighting for God, fighting is the through line. Is it not?
Yes, that's a good point, and we'll be coming back to that later. But so far within these historical periods that we've covered, you've had warlords who are in charge because they're able to control the use of force, and feudal lords and knights who are in control, again, because they control the use of force. So these were warlike, battle-focused, fairly brutal times, and so their heroes tended to be really good at brutality.
Right. And there's still no conception of a hero as anything other than a warrior, right?
Yeah, by and large. most of the epics were about either war or adventure by warriors.
Yeah.
And even the adventure stories like Odysseus trying to get back from the War of Troy involves him raiding various cities along the way.
Right.
So at the point in Western history where we get a Song of Roland, heroes were supposed to stand for something over and above simply being awesome. As the centuries went by, Western literary heroes became somewhat more complex. They started to battle internal demons as well as external adversaries. Think of Jane Austen's novels, right at the beginning of the 19th century, where the heroes are women, and all of her characters, both good and bad, suffer from interior flaws and failings that lead them to hurt and disappoint the people they care about until everything tends to turn out pretty well in the end. But let's take another jump forward, about another 100 years, so we can talk about something that had a major impact on modern ideas of the hero, which is Hollywood movies. And Joe, I know that you're not a movie person, but bear with me on this.
Sure.
If we look at the Western movie genre, early Westerns had heroes that were not that different from Roland. They were virtuous soldiers fighting gloriously against godless Native Americans. I can still remember seeing movies when I was a kid in which the white man hero would fire a single shot from his rifle and 5 or 10 Native Americans would fall dead simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
These early Westerns were very straightforward, almost childlike in their simplicity. But simple heroes require simple worldviews. Stories of heroes don't succeed unless they can resonate with an audience. As societies and audiences grow more sophisticated, then, their heroes tend to grow more complex. You can see that in the way that the movie Western developed over time. Consider High Noon, where the hero is a lawman fighting for justice, but at a critical moment he's betrayed and abandoned by his community, the same community that he'd risk his life for. Or the classic Clint Eastwood spaghetti westerns of the late 60s and early 70s, in which the hero has a personal code, but otherwise he has allegiance to absolutely nothing. He serves as a force not so much for good as for the punishment of evil, riding in from the wilderness, dispensing justice, and riding out again, and sometimes serving that role in such a brutal fashion that it becomes a little unsettling. These films capture the idea of a hero who is alienated from his community, while conventional society is often presented as cowardly or corrupt. There's still an us versus them way of looking at the world, but the them is institutional authority. Virtue is something wielded by individuals rather than groups or governments. This form of hero, I'd say, reflects a more cynical age. Roland trusted without question in his king and his god. The heroes that Clint Eastwood portrayed trusted and believed in nothing and nobody but themselves. You can see a similar development in comic books and the superhero movies that were based on them. The first comic book superhero was Superman, a creature of perfect strength and virtue. He famously fights for truth, justice, and the American way, and there is still an audience for that sort of thing. Meanwhile, Captain America infamously made his first appearance in a comic in which he's shown punching Adolf Hitler in the mouth. It would be hard to imagine a more obvious example of the hero who exists simply to fight the enemies of the country that conceived him. Over time, though, the more popular heroes proved to be the ones that were more complicated. Superman's DC Comics counterpart, Batman, was traumatized by the violent death of his parents, and he's often portrayed as barely in control of his own rage. Meanwhile, Marvel Comics built a bigger audience in the 60s and following by crafting heroes like Spider-Man, who struggles with guilt over the death of his uncle, is unfairly vilified by the press in the city he lives in, and is constantly struggling simply to make ends meet. Comic book characters like Spider-Man and the X-Men are heroes who are alienated from society and the government rather than a part of it. Institutional authority is the enemy, and the stories of these heroes argue that individual courage plus personal responsibility provide the remedy for that evil.
You know, I see your point about the modern superheroes being descended from this modern strand of hero who's alienated and who's more of a rugged individualist, more complicated than the simple heroes of antiquity. But I think we should separate superheroes from heroes because they have capacities above and beyond humankind. You know, they're not human heroes. They're illusions. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, a little bit. Superheroes in general do have superpowers. That's what makes them superheroes. But I do think that we shouldn't simply discard them as a category because they have been so much embraced by the American public that clearly there's an element of that form of heroism that people find very appealing.
Right.
So it's worth taking a look at.
Yes. And they capture the zeitgeist of what's going on in our country right now. That's for sure.
The moral of the story I'm telling today is this. Heroes are an argument. When you describe a hero, you make an argument about the world. What's good? What's bad? Who's one of us? And who's one of them? This fact has figured prominently in one of the controversies within the superhero movies that have been made recently. Both Marvel and DC movies have recently presented diverse heroes, female heroes, non-white heroes, even heroes who are the children of immigrants. The filmmakers are quite open about the fact that this is part of an attempt to broaden the idea of the hero to include more than just white men. When Disney makes 2 Black Panther movies in which the good guys are black Africans, while the bad guys are white arms peddlers, mercenaries, and Western heads of state, it's a pretty clear statement about the world and who among us is truly deserving of the title hero. And that statement has proven very controversial among some fans of the old school heroes. I think it goes without saying that most of the people who loudly complain about a black hero, an immigrant hero, or a female hero are almost exclusively white males who resent anything that feels like a loss of privilege.
Yeah.
Their worldview is also us versus them, but it's white men against women, immigrants, foreigners, and everyone else. Consequently, they see it as a personal challenge when anyone suggests that a hero might not look like them. A similar argument played out during the Black Lives Matter protests in the final year of the Trump White House. Some Americans saw the heroes within that drama out on the streets, the protesters who raised their voices against racial injustice and police brutality. Others, though, saw heroes in the white people who took up arms against the protesters. The way you see the world defines how you'll describe a hero. So let's bring this back to your original question. You noted types of people who have recently been named as American heroes. The firefighters who ran into the Twin Towers on 9/11. The passengers of Flight 93 who fought the hijackers of their airplane and died. And the soldiers who took out bin Laden. There's a very clear us versus them framework to all of these heroes. Under the umbrella of us, you have Americans who are willing to fight in defense of our country and our values. Under the umbrella of them, you have terrorists, Muslims, and foreigners who are very angry at Americans. Personally, I have no problem with calling the firefighters heroes. Anyone who runs into a burning building to save other people is a hero in my book. Full stop. And I have nothing but compassion for the people on Flight 93. They weren't asking to be in that fight for their lives, and that fight ended up killing them. I'm a little troubled, though, by the term hero being applied to members of the military who are simply following orders. That's the job they chose, after all. There were a lot of other people who helped locate and target bin Laden, from intelligence analysts to government officials, and reserving the title of hero exclusively to the ones carrying guns is something that I find problematic.
Me too.
And calls back to the point you made earlier, Joe.
Yes.
It suggests that you don't get to be a hero until you try to kill someone, and I'm simply not on board with that. But that's the thing about heroes. There is no definition of the term that everyone will accept. A hero, like I said before, is an argument about the world, and that's the reason why my heroes might not be your heroes. If you tell me about your heroes, though, I can see the world through your eyes. So tell me, Joe, who are your heroes?
Yeah, well, I usually tell people my hero is Muhammad Ali. And I guess I would defend that by saying he was not only a great fighter who was balletic and graceful and beautiful to watch, but he also had the courage of his convictions to resist the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And give up his livelihood at the height of his powers. That's what really transformed him from merely a great athlete into a hero, for me at least.
Yeah. And fighter, but not someone who killed anybody.
Right. Yes. In fact, a pacifist fighter, if it's hard to believe,
right.
Seems like an oxymoron, but he really defined pacifist fighter.
Yeah. If I try to think of who are my heroes, I mean, obviously my mind goes to sports heroes because as a kid, I was watching a bunch of sports, but also Steve Jobs pops into my head. And I think what that reveals about me is I've always been enchanted by technology, and I also appreciate elegance. And Steve Jobs was a champion for elegant technology. And so he was in some ways a hero for me in that he was an inspirational figure. He showed me things that otherwise would have seemed impossible.
Right.
And that's a pretty good heroic curriculum vitae.
Yeah. I really like your thesis that heroes are an argument about the world. I think that's true. There are things you didn't discuss, though, that I want to bring up. So one is, just to be devil's advocate, I'm with you on not wanting to elevate soldiers who are following orders into heroes. I completely agree with that. I would even broaden it further. And I feel like it's more complicated to make an argument about firefighters running into the Twin Towers as heroes because they were just doing their jobs. Too. They were doing what they signed up to do. You know, I think maybe the term hero is broad enough to encompass both, but I also want us to acknowledge the spontaneous acts of heroism that we hear about all the time. Somebody fell on the subway tracks in New York and was unable to get up. And some guy jumped onto the tracks and literally covered the other person's body under the tracks as the train went over both of them. That's a hero. That's a hero. He didn't sign up to do that, you know? Yeah. He wasn't paid to do that. And so maybe the term hero is broad enough to encompass both of those things. Yeah, but my mind goes toward that guy who jumped onto the subway tracks as my first definition of a hero, more than the firefighter who ran into the Twin Towers. Am I being overly disputatious to say that?
No, I think figures like that deserve the title hero. I have no trouble with that at all. I think they highlight the importance of self-sacrifice in someone who I would identify as a hero. Yes. And self-sacrifice in service of someone else. And I've always found more heroic the person who would do that for a stranger.
Yes. And that gets at a key criterion of heroism that we really haven't discussed, which is empathy. You know, imagining what it's like to be the person in need. That's an important quality that I think defines a lot of heroic acts.
It's possible. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. I would say that empathy is a value that has a limited span of time within human history. People don't really talk about empathy prior to a certain period. I'm not sure Achilles would have even known what we meant by the term. Also, right. You know, me as a dog lover, one thing that I love is stories about the dogs that jump into a river to save someone. And for me, that dog's heroic. Yes. Does that dog experience empathy, or is that dog just protective?
Yes.
I remember reading one story about this woman was talking about her dog who was terrified of the vacuum cleaner, just terrified of it. And then later the woman had a baby. And they brought the baby home from the hospital, and at some point later, the woman was vacuuming, and she noticed that her little dog had positioned himself in front of the crib and was shivering in fear, yet was making sure that he was between the vacuum cleaner and the baby. And for me, that's heroism right there. That's a hero dog.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. So maybe we should say that, and I didn't mean to suggest that all heroes must possess empathy or that it's the number one characteristic, but it's one of many, and it's something that we need to think about. You know, protective instinct is another one.
Yeah.
But here's another question I wanted to bring up with you. Why are so many of our heroes celebrities, famous, including yours and mine, the ones we declared on this program? Do heroes have to be larger than life?
Right.
I think the answer must be no.
Yeah.
So why are our heroes often larger than life?
The historian in me wants to go back to a point that I made way back in this podcast, which is that the term hero goes back to a root which means to do, which is that heroes are doers of things.
Yeah.
And if I think of my mother, she was the biggest positive force in my life for a bigger part of my life. She should be my hero, but I don't think of her as my hero.
Yeah.
Because she wasn't a doer of things. And that's not a criticism of her. It's just sort of where my mind goes when I'm thinking of heroes.
Yeah, well, these are fictional characters I'm thinking of, but as illustrations for our audience, since they don't know the people we dealt with personally, I think of a character like Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. He's defending a black man unjustly accused in the Deep South during the era of Jim Crow. Or how about the juror in 12 Angry Men who basically steers the jury to the correct verdict. You know, they're heroes in their own way, and they're just everyday people. They have a strong moral compass,
Yes.
which is another criterion, in addition to empathy and protective instinct, the things we're kind of bringing out right now.
Yeah.
That it isn't just about prowess in battle and how good a warrior you are.
Yeah, they live by a code.
Yeah.
Yeah, they live by a code, and I'd say a characteristic of a hero is that is a person who does not waver from the code, even when it would be easier for him to do so. Like in 12 Angry Men, where 11 people are shouting at him to shut up and just vote guilty so they can all go home. He would not waver, and that defined his heroism.
Yes. So it isn't just about bravery or strength or prowess in battle, the things that we've, for ages and ages, associated with heroism. It's about other things as well. And they're not mutually exclusive, you know? There are different kinds of heroes. No. And that feeds your argument, which I think heroes are an argument about the world. And we all have different conceptions of the world. So we bring to this discussion our models of heroism, and they're all valid in a way. You know, I just think they skew toward famous people and celebrities in a way that I think is perhaps unhealthy. Like, I would like to believe that the largely Black and Hispanic women who took care of my kids in daycare before they went to school, you know, for very low wages and zero prestige.
Sure. Yeah.
They're heroes to me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely preschool teachers are heroes.
Yeah. Mark, there's one other thing I wanted to bring up, and it's not exactly on the topic of heroism per se, but it's one of the main reasons why I gave you this question in the first place. So I want us to talk about this a little bit. The degradation of clarity in language when we identify so many people as heroes.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's what was motivating you largely when you mentioned this topic to us, which I teased in our last episode. You sent like a email to our group chat about the ridiculousness of calling this certain person a hero. If everyone's a hero, then nobody's a hero.
Yeah.
And I wanted us to talk about that too. And I think of this also in the context of sports, since you and I are both steeped in sports. How many times have you heard the word great used to describe something that is just not great in the world of sports?
Oh, probably a countless number of times. Like the great play that you won't remember even 5 minutes later. Yeah, that's routine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I do think that the term hero is overused. Well, I'm someone who thinks about language a lot, so I think it would be nice if we used terms more selectively. I think as a culture, we tend to fall into a rut of using certain terms over and over again rather than finding the distinct term that really, really captures something. But
right.
Going back to my original idea that the hero is an argument about the world, I think the fact that the term is applied so widely just underscores the fact that people are making arguments. They are trying to shine a light on something and say, this is special. And they use the term hero to signify that. And the fact that you and I push back on that is part of that process where calling someone a hero doesn't make him a hero. He or she only becomes a hero if enough people recognize him. It's sort of like the Tinkerbell effect. If you believe in Tinkerbell, clap your hands and it shall live.
Right.
And so we are currently in a cultural dialogue about who our heroes are. And there are people within the culture who would identify as heroes, people who I find personally repugnant. And so that is an active debate. We're trying as a culture to decide what heroism is. I don't know that we will arrive at a satisfactory resolution of that, or if we'll just splinter into communities that just continue to identify different things as heroic. But this is the history of hero. When you call someone a hero, you are saying something about the world, and you're saying something about the villains who you set against that hero. And that's how you construct the world and present it to other people, hoping to gain followers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm persuaded by that argument. I just still chafe when the word is overused because I really think it degrades the language. And that's important to me, too.
Yeah. Okay, so you feel like I answered your question?
Yes, you did. And I'm glad I gave you a chance to scratch this itch you've had since you were 10 years old. So.
Yeah, it's been bottled up for decades, so thank you for finally letting it out.
Right. Okay, well, you have a question for me.
Yes, I do.
Fire away.
So there's something that I keep hearing about. At first, I thought it was a joke or possibly just a thought experiment. But it does keep coming up, and some people seem to take it very seriously. I'm talking about simulation theory. Simulation theory, if you haven't heard of it before, is the concept that our reality and everything within it might be nothing more than an elaborate simulation. Moviegoers might recognize this as the premise of Matrix films, but some people are at least playing with the idea that it's an actual description of reality. I was listening to a podcast recently in which a very famous pop star revealed that her brother is a big believer in simulation theory. I am perplexed, Joe. I want to better understand the sort of person who believes that simulation theory isn't just the sort of thing that college students might discuss late at night with their friends in the dorm, but might be our actual reality. So please look into this for me, and hopefully we can decide one way or the other whether our entire lives are playing out within a simulation.
Oh, boy. That's such a Mark question.
Yeah, you knew I had to get there.
I'm familiar with the pop culture aspects of this question. Certainly, I saw The Matrix, and this issue has come up in other sci-fi stuff. I never heard it described as simulation theory, though. So I will dive into that, and I'll let you know what I come up with.
Okay. I look forward to talking about it with you.
Yes. Okay, folks, if you have any thoughts about this just taped episode of Mansplaining, or you would like to comment on this or any other episode of the podcast, please go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast. You can like us there, check our sources, leave a comment or question about what you just heard, or suggest topics for future episodes. And of course, it goes without saying we welcome and appreciate that feedback. Mm-hmm. You can also give us a 5-star rating, which we would really appreciate if you especially like this podcast. You can
even call giving us 5 stars a heroic action.
Yes. Well done, Mark. We also have a Google voicemail number where you can call us. That number is 206-486-4074. Leave us a voicemail message with a comment or question. We like to interact with our audience that way. And giving us that rating or review is a way that we know that what we're doing is resonating with you, so we do appreciate the feedback.
Yes.
In the meantime, though, that's all for now. That's a wrap for this episode. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.